What is going on, my fellow nerds? Operator Otter here, and today we'll be covering our first complete and total build guide for Season 4. This is the EbonPiercer Necro. It is a non-minion build that is amazing for all content in the game and one of the best for speed clearing pit 100s in less than 4 minutes for masterworking materials. In this guide, we'll be discussing how the build applies its damage, the gear, skill rotations and when to use them, and different variations of the build so that you can be as informed as possible to melt the legions of hell and get that sweet loot. Let's get started by talking about the end game gear setup, and then we will talk about how the build deals its damage, why we roll specific stats, damage rotations, and then other variants as you start piecing it together. For the helm, we will run Shaco with Topaz socketed. We want our masterwork crits to be on 1, resource generation, and 2 on all stats. For our chest, we'll run Intelligence greater affix, Essence per second greater affix, max life and lucky hit chance to stun tempers with aspect of hardened bones and 2 topazes socketed. We want our masterwork crits to be 2 into intelligence and 1 into essence per second. For gloves, we will run Intelligence, greater affix, and Attackspeed, greater affix, damage over time, shadow damage over time, and lucky hit chance to stun tempers with aspect of the damned. We want our masterwork crits to be 2 into Attackspeed and 1 into Intelligence. For our pants, we will run Intelligence, greater affix, max life, armor, max life, and lucky hit chance to stun tempers, and aspect of shielding storm and 2 topazes socketed. We want our masterwork crits to be 2 into Intelligence and 1 into max life. For boots, we will run Intelligence greater affix, Essence per second greater affix, max life, movement speed, and lucky hit chance to stun tempers with aspect of concussive strikes. We want our masterwork crits to be 2 into Intelligence and 1 into essence per second. For our weapon, we will run two-handed scythe with Intelligence greater affix, max life greater affix, damage over time greater affix, shadow damage over time, and chance to cast blight twice tempers with blighted aspect and 2 amethyst socketed. We want our masterwork crits to be 2 into intelligence and 1 into damage over time. For our amulet, we will run EbonPiercer with greater affix and 2 essence cost reduction and maximum blight projectile damage and a skull socketed. For ring 1, we will run Intelligence greater affix, attack speed greater affix, damage over time, shadow damage over time, and resource generation tempers with aspect of retribution and a skull socketed. We will want our masterwork crits to be 2 into attack speed and 1 into intelligence. For ring 2, we will run Intelligence greater affix, attack speed greater affix, lucky hit chance to make enemies vulnerable, shadow damage over time and resource generation tempers with aspect of inner calm and a skull socketed. We want our masterwork crits to be 2 into attack speed and 1 into intelligence. Our skill bar will have corpse tendrils, blood mist, bone storm, corpse tendrils, decrepify, and blight. Our sacrifices will be reapers, cold mages, and bone golem. Skill tree and paragon can be found in the D4 planner and mobile explainer links below. For paragon, I would recommend the best HP board. Alrighty, that's the build. Good luck and good hunting. You still here? Sweet. Okay, then let's talk a little bit more into detail about how the build is doing its damage and how we will apply it in a practical setting. Join me into the depths of math, fellow nerds. As with all the build guides I do, we want to first talk about the pillars that make the build operate at a functional level. This has been the #1 choke point in build performance for all my stream viewers who are building this build and having performance issues when compared to my build, even though they may have had higher damage stat values. Nothing is more frustrating than not knowing what the problem is. If we know what the problem is, then we know what to work towards and it makes our experience much more enjoyable. The 4 pillars to this build are as follows: Intelligence and attack speed stacking in tandem with wither scaling, essence generation, stun generation and the importance of stagger cycles, and defensive thresholds to stay alive. Let's begin with the first one being intelligence and attack speed stacking in tandem with wither scaling. Alright, so let's start this math extravaganza with talking about wither and its relation to dot damage and also attack speed in terms of the synergy and how we're actually going to increase our damage and why we're building the build the way we are so that we can min-max our damage. Now, I know that this chart may look very daunting. It's a bunch of numbers just thrown into your face without any frame of reference, and so there's nothing to go off of. Don't worry, we're going to go through it one by one, make it very easily digestible. For the most part, this is just a bunch of numbers for the big mathy boys that want to min-max their damage and to kind of have a frame of reference to cross-reference, whatever information they need to min-max the damage of the build itself. But for the rest of us, let's just go into the TLDR version. Let's talk about Wither. What is Wither? Wither is literally just crit for your dots. That's all it is. It's just crit. Okay, Wither states that you have this 5% chance that your dots are going to deal this 50% multiplicative damage. Or you could also reword it to just say you have 5% critical strike chance to deal 50% critical strike damage. It's exactly the same thing. It's not crit, it's wither, but it's still functioning exactly the same. Now, for every 60 intelligence that you give your build, you are going to gain 1% critical strike chance, and you're going to gain 4% critical strike damage. Now, why is this cool? See, with most builds, in order to do this, you have to have this 900 main stat. You get this 90% multiplicative damage modifier to all of your damage. It's a global multiplier. But if you want critical strike chance, you have to roll that in your gear. And if you want critical strike damage, you have to roll that in your gear. Well, the cool thing about wither is that if we just give ourselves 900 900 intelligence, we not only get this 90% multiplicative damage to all of our damage, but we also gain 20% critical strike chance, and we gain 110% critical strike damage. Yes, that is correct. That means that by just dumping everything into one stat, we are increasing not only our intelligence, we are increasing our critical strike chance and our critical strike damage. This creates a third degree polynomial exponential scalar. Now, the exponential scaling is not aggressive, it is not insane, but as we start adding a lot of intelligence to the build, you can start to see this damage become very apparent. And we can talk about this in our expected damage. Now, for the mathy boys out there, I do want to explain a little bit of what this expected damage is. So this expected damage dealt being 10.25 over 10 seconds is not exactly true, because we could proc multiple withers within this 10 seconds at 5% value, right? We could just like hit every single one. We could also just never hit it. But if we take thousands of iterations, what's starting to become more and more true is that every 10 seconds, we are going to proc wither one time at this 5% chance value, which means that we have 19 instances of these dot ticks dealing 10 damage, and then we have one instance of the dot tick dealing 15 damage. And if we take everything, add it up, and then divide it by everything, we get an average of 10.25 damage per tick over 20 ticks worth of damage. That's essentially what's happening here to kind of explain what I'm talking about. So this is not true, quote unquote, but over thousands of iterations, this starts to become more and more in line with what we expect the numbers to be. And the way that I calculated this is through this equation right here. So if you're ever curious, you can look through this and see kind of how I got those results. Now, what's interesting here is, as I said, the more and more intelligence we start to create, things start to get a little nuts. Let's look at 3000 intelligence for a minute. At 3000 intelligence, we get this 300% multiplicative modifier to our damage. And at this 10 base damage value, this means that we should multiply it by 4 to get 40 damage. But if we look at the expected damage value, we get 95. Wait, so you're saying that I get more than double the amount of damage as just pumping into every other build? Every other build in the game, if I just give myself 3000 main stat, with Wither, I'm actually gaining more than double that? Yep, that's exactly how Wither's functioning, and that's exactly how it's scaling, which is a kind of nuts. So this is why stacking intelligence in this build is so vital. It really gives us a serious power increase. And the other thing that we need to talk about is attack speed and how that synergizes with it. So let's talk about attack speed and the other breakpoints as we're going through the build and building it to kind of give you what you should expect in terms of your damage numbers as you're going through building this build. Okay, so looking at attack speed, these are our breakpoints as we're building the build. As we're building the build, you will have 1800, then you'll get to 2100, then you'll get to 2400 and 2700. As you start masterworking gear, you find better gear, you get gear with greater affixes. This is essentially what's going to happen. These are your expected damage values. This is not your expected damage. This is not like what you're going to have. This is just if we are running base damage 10, this is like the scaling that we're going to kind of see with just intelligence being isolated in a vacuum. This is essentially what's happening with just intelligence and wither. So just intelligence and wither in a vacuum with base damage 10, these are the expected damage values that we're going to see. All right. When we start adding attack speed, things start getting a little out of hand as well. So with a scythe, they have 0.9 attack speed, and when you're at 1800 intelligence, you're going to have about 30% attack speed, and this means that your expected DPS is going to be about 52.25. Now, when we go to 2100 intelligence, this is going to be an increase between 1800 and 2100 intelligence. This is going to be an increase about 16 to 17%, and then you're giving yourselves 15% attack speed, but you already have 30% attack speed, so you're really only giving yourself like 10% more DPS on top of that. So if you take 16%, you multiply it by 10%, you're going to gain about 26 to 27% more multiplicative damage. But if we look at this number here, something's odd. 52 to 71 is not a 27% increase. This is actually more like 40 to 45% increase. Whoa, that's nuts, right? By giving ourselves 15% attack speed and giving ourselves 300 in, what we should have said was 27% damage increase, but we actually got like 45%. And this just continues to scale to get out of control to the point to where most builds will be, which is this 2700 and 75%. Some will get 2790%. You start to see this. We can kind of stay in between about 130 damage. That's nuts. That's exactly what's happening. So as we start getting more attack speed in the build, this is a stat that you very much want. We are going to want attack speed, and we're going to run into a problem as we start attacking more with resource gen. We're going to talk about how we solve that issue. But yes, attack speed and intelligence stacking is essentially like the knees bees of how this build functions and why it's dealing as much damage. Now, in terms of observational damage, this is what we kind of want to look at. This expected damage via math, non-observational, is like the average over thousands of iterations. What we want to look here is this. This is like if the stars align with multiple wither procs, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. But at 1800 intelligence with 30% attack speed, your max tick damage should be about 375 million. You'll see about 375 million tick damage when you do your rotation perfectly and everything lines up perfect. You should have about 375 million. And it keeps going up to this point. Right now, we have multiple people that have this 2700 int, and we also have about 85% attack speed, and we are able to hit about 1.25, 1.3 billion. We have had one person who has 3000 int and 90% attack speed because he just has completely GFG gear that crit on literally everything with greater affix gear, and he was actually able to hit this mark, the 1.425 billion damage dot tick, which is just absolutely nuts. And we want to talk about what's going on with that. Why are we seeing variance in our dot damage? So let's go into that right now. Okay, so talking about like the stars line with the multiple wither procs stacking on top of each other and what's happening with that, this is a question that I actually get a lot in my stream, which is, hey Otter, I'm seeing a lot of variance in my dot tick damage. Sometimes I have 200 mils, then 200 mils, then 400 mils, then 200 mils, and then I have a 700 mil. What is going on? That doesn't even make sense. Well, actually, it kind of does. And we're going to talk about why that makes sense. So what we're going to do is we're going to create this scenario, which is just the heads versus tails argument, right? So heads versus tails, you have a 50% chance that you're going to roll heads or tails. And I said, hey, flip 20 coins. How many heads should you get? Well, most people are going to answer, yeah, I should get 10 heads, right? Well, if I gave you a coin and said, hey, flip it 20 times, is your experience going to be heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails? Probably not, right? More often than not, the experience that we're going to have is 2 heads in a row, then a tails, then 3 heads in a row, then 4 tails in a row, then heads, then 3 tails in a row. And you see that like we're actually having multiple instances where we're rolling heads in a row or tails in a row. But here's something that happens. If you take this heads, this is the number of heads I've rolled. So this is the first heads, this is the second heads, this is the third heads. And if we go over here, it's the same thing. First heads, second heads, third heads, four heads. When we go to the end, you see, oh, I've only rolled tails 10 times. I've rolled heads 10 times. That means that if I were to take the total number of 20 and divide it by 10, oh, my chance for heads is still 50%. Even though I had multiple instances where I rolled heads in a row or tails in a row, over multiple iterations, it actually comes out to still 50%. And this is exactly what's happening with Wither. So let's go down here. Let's talk about what's going on down here. So we can kind of make more light of what's going on, all right? So let's say that our base damage is 10 and our wither percentage is 210%, and that means that our wither chance is 45%. So if our wither were to proc, we take this base damage 10, we multiply it by that 210%, we get 31, and then if it does not proc, we just get the base damage of 10. When we attack with EbonPiercer, we have 4 bolts that attack, and if we're nut to butt to the actual target and we cast our Blight, we are actually going to hit the target with all 4 bolts. And this means that we are going to apply 4 instances of dot damage. And if we do 5 attacks and we stack all of them on top of each other, that means that we get 20 total instances of dot damage. But we're not seeing on the screen 20 damage numbers come up. We're seeing 1 damage number. What the game is doing is it's taking the culmination. That's what this little weird symbol is. That's right here, this little E thing. That's the sum of all ticks equals tick 1. That's what the game is doing. So when you see that tick, that main tick damage, it's the culmination of all 20 instances of the dot damage culminating into 1. Now on this first dot tick, what happens here is we get the 10 of the dots proc Wither and then 10 do not. And so we get this amount of damage at the end, and this is what we get. And on the second tick, we get 7 of the ticks were modified by Wither, and the other 13 were not, and this is the damage that we get. On the third, we only have 3 of the dot ticks that actually procced Wither, and the other 17 did not. But then on the fourth one, this is where the multiple Wither procs align. We got 19 of the Wither procs align. All the dots procced Wither except for 1, and this is where we get our super high damage of 599. And then we have the 5th one. Now the thing I want to look at here that's going to be interesting is look at the total number here. These orange highlights with the yellow numbers, this is the number of Wither procs that we had per the dot ticks on the culminations. If we take the addition of those, so we take 10, 7, 3, 19, 6, we get 45. Now we had 20 instances on the first one, 20 instances on the second one, we had 5 instances. So if we take 20 and multiply it by 5, we get 100. So we had 100 total dot instances, but 45 of them procced Wither. Well, if we take 45 and divide it by 100, that's 45% chance for Wither. Oh, that's how that works. So even though we still have a 45% chance for Wither to proc, we can have instances where every single Wither procced, and we can also have instances where none of the Withers really procced. And this is why our damage variance can be seen. This is why our dot damage can kind of go all over the place. So I hope that kind of elucidated what's going on with damage variance when it comes to your dot ticks and what you can expect when you're playing and seeing just kind of all sorts of variables with your dot damage going up and down and up and down and all over the place. And that's essentially what's happening there. The next pillar is essence generation. Because we are trying to attack as fast as possible and Blight has a high cost of 25 essence per cast, we need to have enough essence generation to support give or take 40 essence consumption per second depending on our attacks per second and our essence cost reduction. The way we do this is essence per second rolls in our chest and boots, as well as resource generation in Shaco and both rings. Now I know what you're thinking. Otter, isn't resource generation while wielding a scythe higher than standard resource generation? And to that I say, yep, it absolutely is. It would be a shame if it was bugged and not working at all, wouldn't it? So instead, we have to run standard resource generation. Let's now dive into another Excel chart to discuss mathematically how much essence generation we need for max damage cycles. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit like mathematically in terms of charts of like how much essence generation you need to support spamming Blight for 6 seconds. And the reason we're choosing 6 seconds is because Flesh Eater and Blighted Aspect both last for 6 seconds and they multiply across each other to give you this massive multiplier through the stagger phase of a boss. And the reason why the stagger phase is so important is something we will discuss coming up here soon, so stay tuned for that. But let's talk first. The Blight cost base is 25, and with Imperfectly Balanced, it's going to be 27.25. Now, I don't know if the game is rounding this or not, because in the game, it just says like a flat number. Now, it's really cheap for me when you go into a combat area, Imperfectly Balanced will turn online and it'll increase to 18. But we'll just say 27.25 is kind of like the base cost, right? And so if you're attacking at 0 attacks per second and you're at 0.9 attack speed, because that's the base attack speed of a scythe, you're going to get off 6 attacks within 6 seconds. Now, it's not exactly 6. If you run it mathematically, it's going to be like 6 point something. It's going to be some type of decimal value, but the decimal value doesn't matter because you can't attack a decimal value. You can either attack 6 times or you can attack 7 times. The end. You're not attacking 7 times, you're attacking 6. So we just go with 6. That's the breakpoint, right? This is the total cost of essence. This is the total amount of essence you are consuming within that 6 seconds. To do that. Now, if you have an EbonPiercer with 23% essence cost reduction, if we look here in max roll, it has 23% essence cost reduction. Most players are probably going to be between like 20 and 22%. Max roll is really hard to get, but it's going to be 126. And we have 103 maximum essence because in here we have 100 base, but then we have the 3 unliving energy. So if you take 103 and subtract it from 126, this is going to be 23. This is how much essence we need to generate within 6 seconds to not bottom out in our essence during our 6-second damage rotation when the boss is staggered, which means we only need 3.83 essence generation. And if you run this down the line, this is where most players I think are going to be. In order to run 90% attack speed, you need to run greater affix attack speed in both your rings and your gloves, and they need to triple crit. It is extremely hard to get. I know one player that has it, but it's very, very hard to get. Most players, I think, are going to be between 70 and 80%. So you're going to need about 17 to 18 essence generation per second to support this, which isn't really hard to get. Like if we go here, I'm not running resource generation in the rings, and I'm not running Shaco. Like if we don't run Shaco here, and I don't have greater affix or crits or anything here, you can see that my essence generation is 16.65. If I just crit on the masterworking here and crit on the masterworking here, and I wear Shaco, ta-da. I'm at 23.28 essence generation. That supports the 90% attack speed, right? And you can push this even further. You can get this up to like 35 essence generation per second, which feels really, really good. But you supposedly don't need that much within your 6-second damage cycle. And if you're running an EbonPiercer with 33.8% ACR, which is if you have this greater affix and crit roll, it says 32.7. In game, it's higher than that. I actually have one of these. I have a greater affix and it's crit rolled, so it's 33.8. I don't know what's going on with that. Not sure, but yeah. So don't know what you're going on, max roll. This should be higher. So don't know what to say. But the essence cost reduction, essence generation, this is right. I cross-referenced it with my gear in game and it works. Okay, so this is essentially how much you need in order to support just attacking for 6 seconds. Here's the thing. You ask any experienced player how much essence generation you need for this build to function. If you are running between 17 and 18, you are going to have a very bad time. There are other variables to this build to actually function appropriately. You do not want to attack for 6 seconds straight. You actually want to attack like 20 to 30 seconds straight. And this is to apply stagger to the boss through your stun effects. We'll talk about that in a second. But these are the big boys, right? This is Sirach. This is the original OG of this build. Like he's talked with everybody about this. He talks with me too. He's in my Discord, and we have Magical X, Grims, Carpi, Jashish. These are all players that have like max pit cleared like 110 pluses. We all discussed like how much essence gen you need, like what their experience was. And this is kind of like what we came out to. This is how much essence generation you need in order for this build to function really well. You can take my word for it or leave it. That's up to you. I'm just trying to inform you as best as possible. We cannot vacuumize all of the variables to really show you or tell you, illustrate like, yeah, this is how much you actually need for this build to function. Trust me, you're going to need like this much essence generation. And the way that you do that is that you run essence generation or resource generation in your rings, and then you obviously need to like get a greater affix here, and you need to crit roll it in order to really pump that essence generation up. So that's how that works. We're going to talk about the third pillar now and continue with the video. The third pillar of the build is the stun effect tempers and how it modifies our damage over the moon, as well as keeps us safe within the dungeon. First things first, if something is stunned, it cannot cast abilities or deal any normal attack damage to you, which means you're not receiving damage, so it helps defensively with staying alive. The next thing is the aspects that come into play is its power in staggering the boss. When we stack chance to stun tempers in our gear in tandem with Blight's high lucky hit chance value and the chance to double cast Blight, we are able to apply an absolutely ludicrous amount of CC to the boss very quickly, which allows for fast stagger application. These chance to stun tempers will obviously quickly stun mobs in the pit and give us a 30% multiplier to our damage due to Aspect of Retribution. Aspect of Concussive Strikes has a small chance to be in effect against the mobs in the pit, but it's not much. We more want to run this for the boss stagger rotation. When a boss becomes staggered, it acts as if every type of CC modifier is being applied to it at the same time, which means any modifier in your build that gives you bonus damage to a CC target goes into effect against the boss when it is staggered, meaning Concussive Strikes works because the boss is dazed, and Retribution works because it is stunned at the same time. Here's a very cool thing about Stagger. Any multiplier that is active against a staggered boss double dips and is activated twice. So let's take Aspect of Retribution for example. It states that if a target is stunned, it receives 30% multiplicatively more damage. But when a boss is staggered, this actually double dips into being 30% times 30% or a 69% multiplicative damage modifier to a boss. This also applies to Concussive Strikes and the Control Glyph. So when the boss is staggered, you would think that you would get 30% times 20% times 20% multipliers to a boss, or 87.2% multiplicative damage. But in reality, you're actually getting 30% squared times 20% squared times 20% squared, or a 250.4% multiplicative damage modifier, which is absolutely bonkers in allowing for these 1 billion dot ticks that you're seeing all over the YouTube thumbnails. So yeah, that's how that works and why we run those tempers to stagger the boss quickly, and then run those aspects to create massive damage cycles against the boss when it is staggered. Alrighty, on to the fourth pillar. The fourth pillar is defensive thresholds needed in order to stay alive in the pit above level 100. Obviously, we need a 9,230 armor breakpoint and max resistances. Once you bypass 2,400 intelligence in the build, you actually don't need any resistance bonuses in the gear or paragon. You will actually just have them maxed because intelligence gives you resistance. Therefore, we can put Royal Skulls into our jewelry and have one armor roll in our gear to hit the breakpoint of 9,230 rather easily. The important one is life. From observational experience, it seems 32,000 life is kind of the point where the build can absorb enough damage to function, not get instantly one-shot by everything. To do this, we run max HP board in the planners linked below and run the anti-venom elixir that you can get from Pinch of Poison quest and Gay Cool located here on the screen. With this elixir, you can actually activate it and a standard elixir to have two elixirs active at the same time, which will allow you to run a more life and an offensive elixir at the same time. Okay, so now that we have all the hibbity hoobla of the build out of the way, let's take a moment to talk about two rotations and one extra skill expression trick I think will greatly improve your experience when playing the build. The first one is how you'll be able to maximize your damage and reduce the cooldown of your Bone Storm quickly when going from elite pack to elite pack in the dungeon. This is your standard bread and butter combo. First, you want to decrepify the pack and then look for any champions near the pack and kill them. Champions give 90% damage reduction to any mob around them, so it's important to kill them before you enter your damage rotation. After you kill the champion, perform the following combo. Cast Corpse Tendrils on the elite pack, cast Blood Mist and wait for the pull. Once the pull happens, cast Corpse Explosion 5 times to activate Flesh Eater and apply many dot effects that will decrease your Bone Storm cooldown, spam Blight and watch them instant melt and die. To play off this combo, a cool trick you can do, which is hard to manage and keep track of, but will drastically decrease the time it takes to kill elite packs, is to weave Corpse Explosion cast after Flesh Eater wears off from the pack you just killed as you are walking to the next pack. You want to cast Corpse Explosion 4 times as you are stutter stepping through the dungeon to prep Flesh Eater, and when it comes to the next elite pack, you can perform the same bread and butter combo. But this time when you exit Blood Mist, you only need to cast Corpse Explosion once to activate Flesh Eater, and then you can rip into the mob with Blight. It's a cool trick, but it is a bit hard to manage appropriately, so don't get discouraged if you can't perform it properly every time when you first start to try to do it. The second combo is your boss rotation. To perform this, follow the steps as stated. Decrepify the boss, cast Blight until a corpse appears, cast Corpse Tendrils to apply a big stagger hit to the boss. Continue casting Blight and weaving in Corpse Explosion 4 times to have 4 stacks of Flesh Eater. Once the boss is at 80% stagger, stop all the damage and wait for the second echo mechanic to come out, and then dodge it, or cast Blood Mist to just nullify it. Stand next to the boss and remain still. Decrepify the boss again, cast Corpse Tendrils, cast Blight until the boss is staggered. Once the boss is staggered, cast Corpse Explosion to activate Flesh Eater, and then spam Blight while remaining still and just watch the boss disintegrate. Take note that some mechanics are just always going to come out, even if you time it perfectly, and more often than not, depending on the RNG with the double cast blights, you may stagger the boss early when the second echo mechanic comes out, and in this scenario, stutter step the blight cast while dodging the mechanic. Look, you're going to lose out on 20% damage from Inner Calm, but it's better than dying. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go into the multiple variations of the build, and I'm going to focus a lot on the scaffolding of the build. I do not want to just give you the end game version of the build, because if you just start leveling a Necromancer and you get to level 70, even if you get to level 100 and you try to put the end game version together, it isn't going to function because you don't have the stat break points, you don't have the essence cost reduction, you don't have the masterworking, you don't have the resource generation, you don't have the cooldown reduction. Like, the build is just not going to function, and you're going to get really frustrated because you're just going to get one shot by everything and it's not going to work, and you're going to be like, wow, I just wasted hours of my time building this and this build is crap and I don't want to play it anymore. I don't like that. I want to be able to give you a starter and mid-tier version of the build because it's going to keep you interested and engaged into putting the perfect one together. As well, the starter versions and the mid-tier versions are a lot tankier than the end game version. That allows you to actually learn the rotations and to actually learn how to play the build without getting one shot and to actually have a little bit more fun with it. It's still going to do great damage, but the absolute endgame versions are a little bit more squishy because we're trying to pump out as much damage as possible to really kind of do that pit pushing prowess. So let's start. In this bottom left here, in this drop down menu, we have these multiple variations of the build. And this step one is, hey, I just dropped EbonPiercer. That's it. All I have is EbonPiercer. How do I put this build together? No problem. Here it is. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about it because I'm going to assume most of you know how to read. If you do not, that's unfortunate. But for the sake, just be able to go through this, read what you need. None of this stuff is masterworked. None of it has greater affects gear. This is just the tempers and the rolls of the gear right here. Good to go. Here are the sacrifices. Here's the skills. Here's the skill tree. No problem, right? I do want to talk about a little bit is the board. This is the leveling board. As you are leveling from 50 to 100, this is the board that you want to go to level 100. Here's the thing about this. Where do I go? Do I grab this glyph before I grab Wither? Do I grab both these glyphs before I grab Tenacity? Do I grab Tenacity first before I grab Reinvigorate? Where do I go in terms of this? No problem. I have solved that. So here's your level 50 board. Right here in the drop down menu, this is your level 50 board. And when you turn to level 55.5, boom, here's the next board. And when you go to level 58 3/4, boom, here's the next. And it just scaffolds all the way up into the next point of the build. So it'll tell you the level that you need to be to actually get those points, and then you're good to go as you're doing this. Now, the cool thing about this board is that all of these glyphs are only level 1. You don't need to upgrade these glyphs, except for one, which is the sacrificial. Unfortunately, with sacrificial and you flesh at your board, if it were to be level 1, it's going to be 25 out of 40. If I were to grab these two intelligence nodes, this would be 35 out of 40. It still wouldn't be online. So when you are level 70 to level 80, make sure that you do some nightmare dungeons or grab some friends and see if they can push you through some like 2 or 3 higher nightmare dungeons. And you can get this to level 15 really quick with the increased glyph XP that they gave us this season. And that will turn it on to 40 out of 40. That's the only caveat to this entire experience, okay? Once you are level 97.5, the extra 10 points that you're going to get from 97.5 to 100, you can put wherever you want. But once you are level 100, this is the board. This is the board that you're going to run. Cool. Good to go, right? This is like the best version of the board that we can come up with. Sirach and I worked on this, and this is just like the thing. Sirach did most of the legwork on this. I made some very tiny adjustments. He approved of them. This is the best version that we can come up with. Cool. Good to go. As you're going through this, there's going to be a Black River variant. The Black River variant is basically a hybrid version of using Corpse Explosion with the EbonPiercer. So you're using Blight Corpse Explosion and EbonPiercer to kind of like do a dual version of the build, kind of like in Season 3. It's really fun. It's really cool, but it does kind of cap out. It is not able to go above Pit 100 very efficiently. It is going to be able to clear Pit 100 if you have GFG gear, but it still kind of bottoms out around like 95 if you don't have that GFG gear. But it's still very fun to play, and it's still really good for Helltide. So if you want to get that, try, go for it. But this is, I do want to provide that nonetheless to you. Okay, beyond that, we have the Speed Clear version. This is just the standard version. The only change is that instead of running Aspect of Concussive Strikes, you're just running Aspect of the Void here, and it says that right here. Here's the standard version. This is what I use for 101s to 110s. This is going to be using Concussive Strikes, Aspect of Retribution, and Inner Calm to really do massive damage to those bosses in the Stagger phase. And then we have two other versions, which is going to be either increasing the Bone Storm duration instead of the chance to double cast Blight, or going to be running Osseous Gale instead of Inner Calm to elongate the Bone Storm so that you have more damage reduction against the boss if you are not able to one-shot it all the way through, if you're just having a little bit of trouble with that. Now, the very final version, this is the version that actually cleared 119, and this version runs Osseous Gale and Conceited over Aspect of Retribution and Inner Calm. It also runs Bone Storm Duration instead of double cast to chance to double cast Blight. The reason for this is because once you get to above 110, you're not going to kill the boss in 3 stagger cycles. You just don't have the DPS to do it unless you just have just the stars align on every single rotation. You get multiple wither procs and you don't have echoes that are coming out, which is a very rare occurrence. So what we have done instead is, hey, if we run Osseous Gale and Bone Storm Duration, this is going to keep our Bone Storm up for 30 seconds. We can reset the cooldown of Bone Storm very easily with Decrepify and Blight's Lucky Hit Chance. This is going to permanently keep our Bone Storm up so that we have that 15% bonus damage reduction, as you can read here, as well as the shielding that we're going to get from Aspect of Shielding Storm. And then the Aspect of the Conceited, we're not going to have a lot of stagger cycles because it's going to take a really long time to stagger the boss after 3 stagger cycles. So this bonus 25% multiplicative damage bonus that we gain actually equals out more damage than we would get than just going through those cycles in those 5 seconds with all of those damage multipliers ended up. I know that sounds weird, but that is kind of how it's working. So here are the different variations of the build. I hope that you are informed as well as possible to know what playstyle you would like and how to scaffold into the endgame version of the build. And so now we're just going to kind of go into the outro of the video, and I hope that you are as well informed as the player as possible to play the build how you'd like and how to scaffold it into the end game version. Okay, that's the guide. I know this video was a long one and went into maybe a bit too much detail about how this build functions, but I wanted you as the player to be as informed as possible to have the best experience playing this build. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or praises, make sure to like the video and comment below. Or if you're feeling generous, drop a subscribe to be notified on all content coming out in the future. As for future guides this season, there won't be any more guides that cover something in this detail and will be more rather basic if I do decide to make any more guides. The reason for this is I have received a promotion at work that will consume more of my time, as well as I'm really wanting to get back into the gym to take better care of my personal health.
On Monday we do chest, cause if you want a thick chick, giving your meat slug a throat hug while you're petting her pug, your pecs better be fucking swole.
Why? Oh my God.
But I do stream Monday through Friday, 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and is a fantastic place to ask myself, Kay, or Sirach any questions you may have about anything Necromancer related. That link will be left in the description below. I am currently gearing a Frostercide Sorc because I do like playing other classes from time to time, and the Sorc is just really fun for me at the moment, but I will still absolutely answer any questions regarding Necromancer. As well, there is a Discord link in the description below that has some of the best Necromancer Theorycraft nerds in the channel that love conversing with anyone and everyone about anything Necromancer. So please feel free to come into the Discord and ask any questions as well. I hope you have a fantastic day and a wonderful experience with the EbonPiercer Necromancer. That's all I have for you. Operator Otter, out.